Hi everyone, this is Mac with Simcoe County for Palestine. I'm providing an update here on the campaign Invest in People, Not War. This campaign was started on in June in response to Mayor Nuttall's announcement that Barrie would be putting in place a bunch of measures to attract a defense firm to our city. Here's Mayor Nuttall's announcement at CANSEC, which is an arms trade um, fair in Ottawa on May 28th.
Today, I issued a strong mayor's directive to advance a focused set of actions that will position Barrie and contribute to Ontario's broader efforts as a leader in defence investment readiness. Specifically, we'll update our zoning to designate lands across the city to support defence and sovereignty projects, sending a clear signal our city is ready to accommodate this sector and increase the supply of land for production. We will also expand our employment lands community improvement plan with defence-focused initiatives. We're backing that with an initial $50 million incentive to attract investment and accelerate development altogether. And we're going to establish a dedicated defense and investment concierge model, creating a single coordinated pathway to move projects from concept to completion quickly. These actions, alongside our investments in education, are designed for one thing: make it easier, faster, and more predictable for defense firms to invest in Barrie and in Ontario. Today, I issued.
This is the Strong Mayor's directive that was just issued on the same day. It says that the City of Barrie the mayor is directing staff to amend the City of Barrie Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw 2009-141 as amended to support sovereign defense facilities and or uses approved by the city. So item number 1, changes to the zoning bylaw. Item number 2, that notice be given as required under the Planning Act to update the existing Employment Development Community Improvement Plan to add an additional program with no changes to the CIP area, and that an initial $50 million CIP incentive funding be allocated from the Tax Capital Reserve. So this item is an update to the EDCIP, the Employment Development Community Improvement Plan. This is a document which was passed in March of 2026, and it was a roadmap intended to show a plan for the city to attract private investment. And under this new directive, staff updated this plan with a new program called the Sovereign Investment Readiness Program, which is supposed to attract a defense firm to Barrie. Specifically, the main provision in that was reducing development charges that these companies would have to pay. Then also in this part is a $50 million community improvement plan incentive funding, which would be allocated from the Tax Capital Reserve. Here is a release from the City of Barrie's website saying the same thing. They're going to update the zoning bylaws. They're going to create they're going to update the Employment Development Community Improvement Plan to reduce development charges for sovereign defense industries. They're going to give $50 million to these companies, and there's also going to be a defense and investment concierge who would move projects from concept to completion quickly. I think this basically is a single point of contact for these firms as they're looking to set up in Barrie to help get them through the approval process quickly. This is the plan, and there are 4 elements plus 1. The top 4 are the main parts of the plan that the City of Barrie will control: zoning bylaw changes, development charge abatements, the $50 million incentive, and the defense concierge. The plus 1 is education, which it's unclear if this will be something that the City of Barrie is doing directly or something that will come from some other pocket of funding. Nuttall said in one of the interviews I listened to that the other items were a quote direct City of Barrie item. So I'm not sure what that means for education. It should be said that although the language of these documents is very heavy on the term defense and sovereignty, The Canadian military industrial complex is really intertwined with the US military industrial complex. This slide here is just me trying to make the point that the American war machine is a massive market. The budget in 2026 for the US military was over $1 trillion, which I think is more than the next 7 countries combined. So any private weapons company in Canada, especially given that Canada and the US are so close to each other and have free trade agreements between each other, these private weapons companies expect to have access to this market. That's their main business plan. In 2027, this budget is going to go up even higher. Trump says he wants to make it 1.5 trillion. And this is going to be paid for with cuts to domestic programs in the US, as these things are. This is a nice book which talks about the American military industrial complex. One of the other key features that it describes is the close connections between these private weapons manufacturing firms and the Pentagon. The authors talk about the revolving door, which is basically a phenomenon where you have high-level executives at these companies working at the companies for a while in the private industry, seeking the contracts from the Pentagon, and then after a while they switch over and they work for the Pentagon, and then they go back and forth. And so in this way, there's a lot of crossover and very close connection between these private companies and the US military. Obviously, when these companies make an arm in Canada, the structure still is very much connected to the structure of the broader company, which is very much connected to the Pentagon and the US war machine. The result is that weapons made in Canada often are used by the Americans and other allies like Israel to carry out atrocities. This is an excellent article from Emma Paling at The Maple, which describes or gives specific examples of weapons that are partially made in Canada that are being used in the American war of aggression against Iran. One notable example is Raytheon. This is the second largest weapons company in the world, and they have a division in Midland, Ontario called Raytheon LCAM. Raytheon makes Tomahawk missiles, which is a GPS guided missile, and part of these missiles is made in Midland, Ontario. The missile was used in February to bomb a children's school in a double tap strike, which is when you hit the target once and then wait a while for first responders to come and then hit it again to kill the maximum number of people. And in this case, they killed at least 170 people, most of whom were school children. According to US government contracts, 1 to 2.12% of this work is done in Midland, Ontario. This was a contract from September and the bombing was in February, so it's likely that workers in Midland made parts of the missiles that were used for this atrocity. The part of the missile that they make, there's a bunch of possibilities, but chief among them is antenna for the missiles, but also hardware kits, spares, replacement components. Another local example is the AIM-9X Sidewinder missile. This is a munition that has been used extensively by Israel to commit its genocide, and it also is partly made in Midland. There are a few different ways that under international law these types of exports should be regulated, but they aren't, and although the government pays lip service to international law, it really should be common knowledge that munitions are just going through to Israel. This is a nice timeline also from The Maple, which describes the different phases of the arms embargo campaign and how the government has evaded putting any sort of restrictions on transfers of weapons to Israel. These are two reports which give specific examples of the transfers between Canada and Israel. The first one on the left is called Exposing Canadian Military Exports to Israel, and it documents how Canadian weapons are made in Canada and then shipped to Israel, even after the government said that they weren't sending weapons to Israel. The second one, Exposing the U.S. Loophole, describes how parts of weapons get made in Canada and then get shipped to the U.S., and then they get used to make complete weapon systems, and many of these end up in Israel as well. These articles are available on the website armsembargonow.ca. They're written by the Palestinian Youth Movement, World Beyond War, and CJPME. I would recommend reading both of these. There was an opportunity in March for the government to tighten up these regulations and limit the number of, or limit these types of uses by Canadian-made weapons, but of course the government voted against it. This act would have required end-use certificates on any Canadian-made products so that it could be tracked where the weapons or the parts of weapons that are made in Canada end up. So as it currently stands, there are no restrictions on these types of trade between Canada and the US. There might be a little bit more between Canada and Israel, but they're still doing their best to send weapons to Israel directly. So with that background done, let's get into the plan in more detail. I'm going to start with the bottom two items, education and the defense concierge. Background out of the way, I'm now going to come back to the City of Barrie's plan. I'm going to start by discussing the last two items, education and the defense concierge. So the press release from May 28th said that Barrie's investing in Georgian College and Lakehead. There's a $2.5 million investment in Georgian College over 2 years to strengthen defense-focused education as a military-connected college, and up to $20 million to support Lakehead University's expansion in Barrie. I think the idea here is to have co-ops between different trades, programs, and whatever defense firm comes to town, and also to sweeten the pot for the defense firms and giving them a long-term and stable source of skilled workers. Kevin Weaver, the president and CEO of Georgian College, says that Georgian College is grateful for the $2.5 million investment in the college from the city. Dr. Gillian Siddall talked about the STEM Hub. This STEM Hub predates the announcement on the activity on the defense for defense firms, and I think that's going to be the main way that the city sees Lakehead supporting these firms is through programs that are going to be out of that STEM Hub. The other item here is the defense concierge. So I think this is, as I said, a single point of contact for these defense firms as they're coming through to Barrie. And this is a clip from an interview that Nettle gave shortly after his announcement, where he describes, I think, the general approach that these firms will have, that the concierge will have towards these firms.
If a defense company's coming to town, they're not, waiting in line with all the other companies that are looking to come into Barrie. Yeah. We want them to be moved to the front of the line. We want to give them that, white glove service to help them get through any of the hurdles that can come up in the development process and in the site selection process. So it's really wrap our arms around every defense manufacturer, every company that's going to contribute to Canadian sovereignty, and walk them right through to the finish line.
So now we'll talk about the top three, which I think is more the meat of what the City of Barrie is going to do. The first is regarding zoning bylaws. So a strong mayor directive was initiated, or was put forward by Nuttall, that would amend this zoning bylaw. So the zoning bylaw is a 400 plus page document which details how different lands can be used and provides rules um, for property owners about how they can use their lands. The amendment would exempt defense firms from these provisions. So the old text said anything contained in this bylaw, sorry, notwithstanding anything contained in this bylaw, any public utility or service owned and operated by the City of Barrie is not subject to the provisions and standards of the zoning bylaw. So what this means is that property owned by the City of Barrie was not regulated under the bylaw. Now the text says, notwithstanding anything contained in this bylaw, any public utility or service owned and operated by the City of Barrie, as well as uses or facilities required to support sovereign defense as approved by the city, province, or federal government, shall not be subject to the provisions and standards of this zoning bylaw. So now we're putting the projects required to support sovereign defense right up with the city-owned properties and giving them that privilege of not having to obey any bylaws. They have a definition of sovereign defense, which is pretty broad. I'll just bring so quickly it just says research, develop, test, manufacture, assemble, maintain, repair, upgrade, store, and sustain advanced technologies, products, equipment, and systems that support Canada's ability to protect its territory, infrastructure, and population, and to maintain long-term operational readiness without reliance on foreign production or sustainment for essential capabilities. Now, what's interesting is it says at the end, to qualify, a capability must be critical to the ability to defend Canada, an area of strength in Canada, or have the potential to be one, and in demand by our allies and partners to support collective defense and enable exports. So even though this first part talks about sovereign defense, it's about Canada maintaining or protecting its territory and population without reliance on foreign production. At the bottom here, it says, and in demand, these capabilities, in order to be defined as sovereign defense, must be in demand by our allies and partners to support collective defense and enable exports. So they must be able to export weapons to the US or parts of weapons to the US in order to receive this discount or this treatment. This is the table of contents from the comprehensive bylaw. Like I said, it's a massive document, and I don't know why the defense firms need to be exempt from all of it. I have a theory about why the city is approaching it that way. One is that it could just be a real subservient gesture, like showing that we're just going to do everything we can, forget the bylaws. We just want you to come here. This is the kind of smooth sailing that you're going to enjoy if you come to Barrie. And two, which I think is more likely or more important, I think there's something specific in this bylaw that is a problem for these defense firms. And I think that if the city just exempted them from a specific bylaw, it would attract a lot more attention and blowback than if they just exempted them from this before there's a specific company that's been announced. They just exempt them from the bylaws writ large, and that brings makes it happen quietly as opposed to being more scrutinized. So I went through the bylaw quickly, and I welcome anyone else who wants to do that, because I think there's a lot in here, and we should try to understand what might be a problem for defense firms. But one that stood out to me was the Conservation Authority regulated areas. So conservation authorities are meant to protect drinking water. They were developed in the wake of the Walkerton E. coli contamination, and they're government bodies which regulate watersheds. So in Barrie, there's the Lake Simcoe watershed, and then there's also the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority. Both of these are have certain areas which are shown here on the map, the dark blue being Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority and the light blue being the Nottawasaga Valley, that are regulated by these by these authorities. So there's certain uses that are not allowed, and any development that happens on them has to be approved by these authorities. Now, one interesting element here is that the lands which were annexed from the surrounding municipalities, which are shown here, these are around Little Lake at the top of Bayfield Street here, and then in the southwest of Barrie, close to the Menacing Swamp. These, I think, have a lot of overlap with the conservation zones. So, and Nuttall has pushed these annexed lands as a location where development for weapons companies could happen. So I'm wondering if that's part of the rationale for waiving, exempting them from bylaws, is so that they don't have to be subject to these conservation authorities. Here's an interview of Nuttall talking about or a clip of Nuttall talking about the annexed lands.
You kind of glazed over it, but you talk about the land that Minister Flack put in and Premier put into Barrie.
Yeah.
How important is that now in looking at all the things you're trying to do?
Wild. You know, if you don't have the fundamentals right, then you can't respond, right? You can't respond to the market. So changes that we saw with our boundary have brought in 4,400 acres. Just under 1,000 of that is set aside today for industry. We could definitely put more aside for that in the future. It's a massive win for the city. You know, serviced industrial land that's ready to go. It doesn't really exist anywhere. We were down to about 200 acres. So to have another 1,000 brought in and going online, that's a huge win. I think the other thing that's important is the defense sector. The way that they grow is that you'll have somebody come in with a capability, and then you'll have companies go around it. So individual smaller hubs. Yeah, exactly. So you could have one hub with 8 companies. That hub's because of a capability that went in. The 8 companies are getting the final products and sending it, out to their clients. So it's interesting. You need to have a large amount of land set aside for what initially is probably a smaller capability investment, but then the other companies come to do assembly around it.
So that describes, I think, Nuttall's fantasy for what could be the future for these annexed lands. It's also interesting to note that the province is also attacking these conservation authorities. So this is a nice article from the Narwhal, which talks about Ontario amalgamating the 36 conservation authorities into 9 regional bodies. Presumably this is being done to whittle away at them and reduce their power against developers. One public servant said that the province has essentially handcuffed conservation authorities. So this move with the bylaws is connected, I think, to this broader attitude that the province is displaying towards conservation authorities. So the last 2 items are the development charge abatement and the 50 million incentive. The development charge abatements are laid out in this amended community improvement plan. The community improvement plan was amended in June to include the Sovereign Defense Investment Readiness Program, and it has development charge abatements detailed in the plan. So for anything over 100,000 square feet, there's a 100% development charge abatement, and then there's lesser abatements for the smaller operations. Development charges are fees which are levied by municipalities against developers, and they're meant to recoup some of the costs that municipalities have to take on when there's a new development in town. For example, if you're building an apartment building, there may be more traffic in and out of that building, so the city might have to study what the potential effects will be and then initiate some measure to mitigate it. So they might have to put in a traffic light, for example. There's a cost to that. You have to pay all the staff who come up with that. You have to contract out the services to put in the new light. So the the development charges are meant to get some of that cost back to the city. On the housing front, Nuttall has been using the strategy of deferring these development charges in order to attract private developers to come to Barrie and build apartment buildings and condos. So this was part of the reason why Barrie ran a deficit this year. There's a nice article by Brett Glover in the Barrie Advance, which says that the city of Barrie had a 1.35 million deficit for 2025. This was driven by higher winter cleanup costs, the ice storm, and development charge discounts. In that article, it also says the year-end report shows Barrie's tax-supported operations actually generated an unadjusted surplus of 2.4 million in 2025. However, that surplus was wiped clean after the city granted 5.3 million in discretionary discounts and exemptions for development charges over the year. The city is legislatively required to reimburse development charge reserves for these discounts, so it had to dip into its operating funds to do so, which is what led to the deficit. So more of that is planned by Nuttall for weapons companies. Lastly, the 50 million incentive is here's a clip of Nuttall talking about that incentive and the rationale behind it.
$50 million seems like a significant.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
But when you think about, Brian, the idea of trying to get businesses and jobs to Barrie, and the amount.
$50 million seems like a significant.
It's a huge number.
Yeah.
But when you think about, Brian, the idea of trying to get businesses and jobs to Barrie, and the amount of investment that takes place just in a single project to deliver. You know, I think the smallest project that we're looking at right now, it's about a $20 million project to make happen, and there may be a tiny piece that will contribute to be part of that. Some of these development programs are billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you can secure billions of dollars of investment in your community to create taxation for the municipality, to create jobs, those people then both have jobs, get to live a great life in Barrie instead of being on the highway to Toronto, but also they then pay employment taxes, right? And you package that all with the base burden effect that's already there. The $50 million is a lot of money. It's going to help create a lot of jobs in the city of Barrie. I think this is just the start.
So that's Nuttall's rationale, basically that it's a lot of work for these investments to happen and we should do what we can to help them. For contrast, these are the profits of the top 5 weapons companies in the US. They're all in the billions of dollars. I mean, the idea that a municipality needs to be giving money to help these guys who have all this spare profit lying around is a bit ridiculous to me. The 50 million incentive is going to come from the tax capital reserve. This reserve is basically a pool of money that supports core functions of the municipality. It is the main funding source for all tax-supported, non-growth related capital work. This includes, but is not limited to, renewal work on roads, parks, facilities, landfill, as well as many strategic projects. So these are the largest draws on the tax capital reserve for 2025. And if you look at the numbers, it's nowhere near this 50 million incentive that the mayor is wanting to pull out of this reserve. 20 million for facility renewal programs, 19 million for pavement management programs, 16.7 million to replace the transit fleet. The beginning balance in 2026 was 77 million. So taking 50 million out of that is going to drain this reserve pretty quickly. So key points about the 50 million incentive, it's coming from the tax capital reserves, and the second is that it's going to be allocated by the city's chief administrative officer. There's nothing really more that we know about it other than that. So moving past the City of Barrie's plan, I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to some partnerships between local manufacturers and how those are shaping up. On June 15th, there was an event at the Sandbox, which is in downtown Barrie, and this was a dual use and defense 101 day. So dual use means that the facility makes something that's for civilian purposes and something else that's for the military. And I think the idea here is to speak to local manufacturers and coach them on changing their activities to align with defense firms that might be coming to Barrie. Here are a list of local manufacturers who are already making things for defense. So I think these smaller manufacturers would be tied to a bigger company that came to town in some of these regional hubs that the mayor was talking about. So that's it for the update. Next steps for us, we have the opportunity to appeal bylaws 077 and 076. That might be a typo. I think it's 078. But anyways, it's the bylaws about the zoning, the changes to the zoning bylaw, and also the bylaw which amended the community improvement plan. So we're going to look into that. There's also an open letter, which I would encourage everyone to sign. You can sign as an individual. And if you're part of an organization, I'd encourage you to speak about it with your organization and see if they'd be able to sign as an organization as well. I will attach the link for the Google form to this YouTube video. And then lastly, please get in touch with us. This is, if we're going to fight back against this, it requires a lot of work from a lot of people. And we need to start by just explaining to people what's going on and making connections with people who are going to be affected.